I just want to see if it's clipping at all. So like when we're talking.
You don't even need to be that close necessarily. I'm curious, well, like what sound level do we need to talk at too?
Well, just talk normally. So like if we're going through this.
Don't be like yelling at the...
Well, let's see if that picks up. Also with wind noise. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're out here doing another video.
I don't even think you need to talk that loud. Like
but
the mic is here,
That's
dude.
how I normally talk. All right, should we go check it?
Yeah, check it.
This is very zoomed in. It's gonna take an adjustment period.
You're just gonna stand back.
Now I'm filming you like I'm filming Sunny. What's up, dude?
Hey, man.
I hope you look okay.
I hope I look okay too.
Yeah, it's so small.
Dude, it's way smaller.
It's like a short course truck.
Yeah, it's way smaller out in the open.
Yeah, when it's like out of. And the seats are in it?
Seats are in, yeah. They're just tacked in right now, but you'll at least be able to, like, this is where the seats will be. So you'll be able to sit like in the driver's seat, and then the factory steering column I just have hooked up right now so we could turn the truck. But you can at least sit in it and kind of get a feel for steering and then kind of see like where everything's at. But like seats.
That's cool. Yeah, I saw you guys were chilling in there yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so much space between the seats. It's gnarly.
Yeah, oh yeah, it is. Whoa.
Like when you sit in it, like it's like looking in our truck, like you're looking over at each other.
They look for sure lower too.
Yeah.
Like than they were.
Well, yeah, cutting the pivot box out.
Yeah, like even before they were fine, but like now they look like just.
A little janky setup right now, but
There's so much room in the center. Oh my god. That's crazy.
Yeah, usually like these seats are touching each other.
like hold that and then.
Well, these seats are so good.
But yeah, so like the floor, like just to kind of reference it, like this tube right here is the floor. So if you put your feet like up against this and then on the frame rail, it's pretty close to what it'll be.
So like.
What do you think of like the shifter position? Like, is that comfortable for you? When I sat in it, that felt
compared to before, yeah.
really
I mean,
good.
before it was fine, but
Dude, it's,
I mean, you know, if the seat was right here and the shifter was up here, I'd have to be.
you'd be reaching,
and
but
you
that's
gotta
the thing.
think with harnesses, it's
Yeah.
like I'd have to be like.
But like sitting in the, like, dude, you have a good amount of headroom too. That was another thing that I was worried about. Like if you really want to know, like the piece of wood down here, the 2x4, if you put your foot on top of that, that's the floor.
Yeah.
Because it, like the floor is not going to be on the frame rail, but it'll be on the, just right above it. It'll definitely be tight, but it's not as bad as I think it was going to be.
Yeah.
It's weird too sitting in there and like you're in line with the shock, in line with the beam pivot. Like it's weird seeing all that because there's no firewall.
And it's just right here. Big chilling.
Just chilling.
Just new truck goofing.
Yeah, like you, like even the way you sit, like how you look inside of the door opening too, like you're sitting where you need to be.
Yeah, that's what I thought when you sent me a video yesterday. Like,
Yeah.
I think Jake was sitting right here.
Yep. Well, like put your arm on the armrest. Chill.
You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
What are you doing, dude? Oh. You better not do that right
No,
now.
I'm not. I gotta remember I'm mic'd up too, so I can't even be laughing while you're talking.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be doing another update video on the Ranger build. We have a few new things for this video. One, we're going to be using the main camera again. Let us know if you like the video quality in this one. Two, after a lot of requests in the previous video, Chris and I are now mic'd up, so you can probably hear him from here pretty clear.
Mic'd up, baby.
There you go. So let us know if you like the audio in this one as well, and we'll continue to use the mics in the future. As always though, we got Christian here to walk us through the truck. Big update, the truck is back outside and rolling on its own weight.
Yep.
This is really cool to see. Like,
yeah.
First time with the new front end, new rear end rolling outside. You did mention that it has been outside one time in the past, but that was with the old front suspension. But
And that was with you not being here, so it wasn't on camera or anything. I got clips on my phone, but for at least for the video for YouTube stuff, like we didn't film any of that.
Right. So I mean, this is my first time seeing it outside since it's gone into the garage. So it's really cool to be able to walk around the truck and kind of go through all the details. Maybe as always, start up front and start where you want to, and we can go back through this thing.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in the front from the last video. So you guys saw the motor was in it before, and then all the front suspension and steering was on it. But now, obviously, the whole engine cage is there, and then shock mounts are all in place, and the truck is sitting on its own weight, which is pretty cool. So the first thing after the video that we shot the last time, the first thing that I got started on was just the main engine cage structure. And that consisted of just getting these main 2-inch 120 wall tubes in first, these outside ones that go all the way to the A pillar up underneath the cowling.
Yep.
And then comes out, and then this structure right here that has the miters in the corners, and then just a nice X through the center just to kind of protect the radiator. That's one thing that I've learned with building these trucks is if you can, sometimes it's not possible to do. And we went back and forth on radiator size on this thing, but one thing that you want to try and always do is get the radiator protected on these trucks. So sometimes you'll see like an engine cage built, and then this radiator will be sitting out here on the outside. Mm-hmm. And what will end up happening is if you, for whatever reason, roll this truck or you get smashed in the front, the first thing to get hit is the radiator, which is not ideal at all. So on this truck, I wanted to put the radiator inside of the engine cage. That was always like my main intention. So
just more protected from the environment.
So we touched on the radiator in the last video before it was mounted, but this is a 31 by 16 instead of like the standard 31 by 19, which is like what's in our truck. It's just a little bit smaller in height profile, but the width is still the same. On these Rangers, it does get kind of tricky because the frame rails are pretty narrow. So like if you could see on this side, the port for the radiator is literally directly in line with the frame rail. I knew that obviously going into this, and like when you look at it, you're like, what the heck is going on here? But just, it's gonna end up getting cut off. I'm gonna direct it in a different way and then notch out where I plated in the frame, I'm gonna notch that out a little bit so everything has a nice clear path. But
yeah, and I mean the front of the truck just has a character of its own now with this as well. Like obviously you have to land onto the chassis, onto the frame rails.
Yes.
So then you have to come out wide enough to clear the radiator, so that adds kind of this unique shape up front. And so was this all kind of built on the bench and then placed on the truck in order to get all this welding done?
Yeah, so well, not the welding, like all the welding was done on the truck, but just to get this main, like what I started with before all this stuff was on here was the front caps for the frame rails. So in the previous video, the factory frame was still there, and then the weird section of the old bumper was still on there just to hold the frame rails together.
Yeah, so let's touch on that. So like what made you want to cut that off and just make your own frame horns there?
It's clearance for the radiator. So I knew, like I have measurements written down up there on the cowl of where the factory core support was before, like height-wise off the ground, and then also where the hood came down and the distance from this cowl out to where the hood latch was basically, and like where the header panel for the grille and headlight assembly was. So I knew what parameters I needed as far as height went to be able to get this radiator in here and have everything clear under the hood still. So to get the radiator down low enough in the chassis, I had to cut the frame down in height to bring everything down lower to be able to get this radiator to sit in here.
Right.
So that's what led to doing the frame rail. And it came out good. Like it's definitely, it tapers down and then it gives you a nice spot for the new bumper to be able to like tie in off of.
Definitely.
So,
and it looks like for the radiator mounts here, is this just a bolt-on setup that you have on both sides?
Yeah, so there's 2 3/8 bolts on each side that hold the radiator onto the frame rails, and then there's just nuts welded into the frame, like into these frame horns.
Cool.
So it's just a nice, simple little bracket that goes onto this tray that the radiator sits into. And then you can see on the bottom side too, like all the dimple dies and just trying to add some design to it, but also...
Are there 3 holes in there? There's
no, there's 4. There's 4 in that one.
That's off-brand. I don't know about that.
It was just to make it look right, like width-wise. It had to do that because the main thing, don't worry, I was thinking about it. I was thinking about doing that. But the main thing is like there's a screw, and you can see it in the top too. There's a screw right in the center of the radiator that holds a shroud onto it.
Awkward to have the dimple.
It would have been weird to have it in the center, so I had to offset those, and then I had to offset off that. So.
All right, I'm gonna let this one slide just since you have some good background on that.
But that it's not only there just for looks, but it's also adding strength to that because this tray is all 13 gauge steel, so and it's press broke, but to be able to add that rigidity to it, so it wasn't just some flimsy piece that was like just bolted to the frame rails, like those dimple dies are actually adding strength to that whole tray.
Yeah, so it's a strength thing, and also if you get any water in there, just flow right out.
That too, yeah.
So that's a really nice feature that you added onto that.
But yeah, so that getting the radiator in, that was kind of after the whole main structure was in, but I guess if we're going front to back, like getting that radiator in, the tray was the first thing to get put on, and I didn't want to just weld that tray directly to the frame rail because God forbid if he does smash the front of this thing in, at least those will be able to get unbolted if that gets mangled up, and you could just pull it out of the chassis real easy and then just remake one and put it back in. Whereas if that was welded to everything, then it would just it just
cutting
causes,
stuff off the truck is no fun.
It's not fun, no. So that that's why that got bolted in. And then it also too, like if he wants to get this powder coated, the tray powder coated, you can pull it off, powder coat it, throw it back on, and then it's nice and coated. Because if water does get in there, it's going to pool up.
Yep.
So you don't, if it's just paint, it could start corroding and, you know, all that kind of stuff.
Cool. One other thing I want to touch on here, because it is different, and I haven't seen this done very much personally, is this is all just one tube coming from the outside.
Yeah.
Whereas on a lot of trucks, including ours, is from the A-pillar here, from where it splits in the center.
The windshield bars, yeah.
Yeah, it'll come down, and that will be your main bar that comes down to the frame rail. And then this outer one will come around and then connect to that somewhere in the center.
Yeah.
But here you decided to go with just one main tube
Single.
there. Yeah, and then mount your shocks off of that. So I think that was really unique and something that I haven't seen very much.
Well, they're like another one of my like things that I wanted, one of my intentions out of this whole front end was this has the V6 in it now. It's eventually getting a bigger motor. So to fit a bigger motor into this truck at some point, I wanted to have everything open in the center of the truck. So to do that, like having all the tubes outside as wide as you could was more beneficial than trying to do the 2 stringer tubes that a lot of engine cages are built around. And then having another thing too with shock mounts, and we'll touch on that, but just having 2 separate shock mounts for the coilover and the bypass instead of having one, which is what it is now.
Let's jump into that right now. So you decided to go with just one inline setup. Ours are staggered side by side.
Yeah.
So this is just a simpler mounting solution and assembly on your end. And then you have, obviously the shocks are inline and mounted off the radius arm and the beam corresponding.
So when you're doing shock mounts, we've touched on this many times, but you want to bump the vehicle out, have the shocks fully compressed when you're mounting shocks. And then to get the angles correct, you just want everything to be less than 90 degrees to the radius arm at full compression. So getting all those parameters in place with the way that they mount off the bottom. So the bypass is mounted off the front of the beam, and you could tell like the top of this bypass mount is going to be real close to the hood. Yeah. So like there was no putting that on top of the beam, like it had to go on the face of the beam, running this 14-inch coilover and 16-inch bypass setup. The bypass is so big at full compression and how far this thing bumps out, like it has to be mounted on the front side of the beam. So that goes in the very front, and then the coilover mount is off the radius arm. So when you have everything bumped out like that and you're looking at it, or when I was looking at it, trying to figure out shock mounts, the thing that made the most sense to me, especially keeping in mind I wanted to have the center of the truck open, was to do something similar to like what rear shock mounts look like, where it's all, the shock mount is just one and it has both shocks incorporated into one mount.
Yep.
So that this looks very similar to what a rear shock mount would look like. And it kind of lends to itself too, because if you look at it, like where the bypass mount is on the beam and the coilover mount is on the radius arm, they're in line with each other. So it makes sense to have everything kind of shoot in that same direction.
Yep.
And it's just, to me, it's a lot simpler. It's a lot more streamlined. And this is probably the way that I'll start doing these I-beam engine cages from here on out.
And also cool, you have these weld-in washers as well, which I think is really cool and just provides a nice surface for the bolt to go through.
Yeah.
And make sure you're not going to ovalize that hole out.
Yeah, so you're adding thickness. So these weld washers are from Dirt King, from their builder parts section. You can go on their website, you can go into the shop and get those. It does make it very nice for the mounting provisions, because typically, like instead of just doing, this is all 3/16 plate, but instead of just doing 3/16 plate and then doing like an 1/8 overlay that you weld on the outside of that, whatever the design is, or if you just do a circle, whatever you do, this is just a lot cleaner looking in my opinion. And then it also matches the back. Yeah. So the back has the same situation where it has the weld washers on all the pivots, and then it also has all the weld washers on the lower pivots as well. So same situation, so it's bulked up top and bottom for everything. So no bolt holes are gonna have any problems on this thing.
And just to be clear, that's something that you can go to Dirt King and buy directly, correct?
Yeah.
Cool.
They got a bunch of stuff literally on the shelf that people can go and buy.
Oh, buddy. Got a little helper today. What I think is really cool about this as well is, since you already had the structure here, you chose to make tabs off of this for the top of the radiator support as well, and then you brought this all in and tied that all together.
Yeah, so the main 1.25-inch tube that's ran through here is holding the radiator down. So there's 3 points, actually 4 points on the top, holding everything down. And then these 2 tubes coming out are just there to add support to the whole, like to the main engine cage structure, and then to keep that section of the engine cage from wanting to come in on itself. So it is holding just support for the radiator from trying to move back and forth, but it's also on these trucks typically from shock mount to shock mount, usually there's a crossover that goes over the top of the engine. But on this one, because of how high the intake sits on this thing and the hood clearance, I couldn't do something that just ran over. And with how far back these shock mounts actually are in the engine cage, I didn't want to do something way far back because it just visually wouldn't look right. So having something that ties in all these points in the front, kind of actually in the center of this engine cage, kind of just ties everything together real nice.
It's like
and
a diamond, and then it opens up in the center so you can get the motor out of it.
Yeah, and that's the cool thing too, is like all this stuff is removable. So obviously this needs to come out to be able to get the radiator out of the truck, but these also get removed too. So that way, when you need to pull the engine and trans out of this thing, everything can just come out once you have the radiator and all this structure removed. It'll just come right out of the truck.
And there's two things that I think are really cool about this. One, you're on brand, got the 3 holes in there. No one's going to complain about that one.
Nope.
But also, likewise with some of the stuff that you did on the rear of the truck, is everything that's bolt-on, you TIG weld. So I really like that, and it came out really nice for everything on the front.
Yeah, so everything is all dual pass TIG. I'm trying to keep with that theme of everything that is bolted onto the truck be TIG welded, and then everything that's on the chassis of the truck is all MIG welded. So that's just kind of keeping up with what we were doing on the back and just kind of bringing that to the front. But yeah, this came out really good. It's kind of, the way that I mounted this radiator is a little bit different too. So usually, or sometimes you'll see like kind of how the bottom has a tray. People will do a tray on the top as well. And then it runs the whole length of the radiator on the top. And then you have some sort of like tension rod on each side that holds the radiator kind of collapsed in the truck. On this setup, because of how the packaging was in the front of this thing and how tight this radiator actually sits in this engine cage, the way that I did this was I just did 3 tabs on the top side, and then the center has this bigger plate that has the 3 holes in it, like you're talking about, and then it also press brakes and comes over the front side, and then there's also a tab on the back side in the center here. I don't know if you can get that on camera, but there's also a tab back here that has a bolt in it as well. So it's holding everything in place from not wanting to move around. Like this radiator is in here really good. So that would be an issue if the whole front of this truck wasn't tied in real well, and there was going to be flex in this whole front end. But because everything does have a bunch of tube structure on it, and especially once the front bumper is built off the front of this thing, it'll tie all this stuff together, and then this radiator is mounted kind of in the center of all that stuff. So there's a lot of structure built around this thing, and none of this is necessarily going to be moving around. And I couldn't do any like rubber mounts or anything for this because right here on the edges, on the sides of the radiator, it does get real tight, which is why these tubes are smaller diameter than everything else for the engine cage.
Is that 1 1/4 inches?
It's 1 1/4 inches, yeah. So one, it was to be able to package into the radiator and not have a bend in those tubes. And then also 2, it kind of ties, like if you look at the side profile of the truck, there's the main tubes of the engine cage, which is all 2 inch. Same thing with this, that's kind of the main structure right here. And then this is 1 1/4 inches, and then also all this X is 1 1/4 inches. So it kind of flows around the front of the truck and around the radiator. So it just kind of ties everything together. It's not, the whole front of this truck is not like what you commonly see, which is something I also wanted to do too, is just kind of make it look a little bit different than what the norm is. And that's like, to me, that's super cool.
Yep, and I think you nailed it on the head with that. This is very different than anything I've seen. So we touched on shock mounts, touched on the radiator mounts. One thing that we haven't talked about that we mentioned a little bit in the previous video is steering. So we did mention in the last one that the steering box had to get relocated. Again, this is just to move the box up and out of the way so that the pitman arm does not interfere with any of the other tie rods as you're going to full compression. This is a little bit different than what we did on the 92 F1 build, because with that truck, we already had the engine cage together and we were building the new suspension around it.
Building around what was already there, yeah.
So what we did for this top mount for the box is we drilled a hole in the main tube that was crashing onto the frame rail and then put a sleeve through that tube. Whereas here, since it was a blank slate, Christian and I were talking over the phone and decided, why not just build a box structure? Was I here?
Yeah, you're here. The last time you were down here, we were talking about that.
Okay, so we decided, why not just build a box structure off the frame to make it look like it's part of the factory frame, and then just mount the box off that. And then we can crash the tubes down onto that rather than making it look like an afterthought that was kind of just put on the truck. So Christian seized the opportunity with that and remounted the box and added all that structure there and then crashed his tubes on.
And we could kind of talk about that too. So like, obviously the truck's out here, all the steering is done now. So before,
can we take a look at that?
Yeah,
it's
so
really,
before,
it's really nice taking a look at all this on the truck.
We had just the 3 tie rods on. So the 2 main tie rods and then the connecting tie rod tying the 2 swingers together. So now the pitman arm was on the box before, but the pitman arm's on, and then now this final tie rod is made. and then also this mount for coming from the pitman arm over to the connecting tie rod. This mount has been made to get everything connected together. So when you do it this way, sometimes like you'll go from the pitman arm over to the swinger, which is the most ideal because I'll talk about that in a second, but on this truck you couldn't do that because of frame clearance. So you can tell I did notch the frame for the tie rods and the swinger and all that stuff to swing inside of here. But if I pulled this edge further forward, the swinger tabs on the outside of the frame rail would be sacrificed basically, like they'd get really small on the frame. So I didn't want to do that. And also too, like coming from how high this pitman arm is up in here down to here, that tie rod would have been at a pretty gnarly angle coming down to the swinger. So I didn't want to go that route. So to try and keep everything in line as possible, I just made the mount similar to like what we have on our truck as well. I made the mount come off of the connecting tie rod. And when you do it this way, the main concern is that center tie rod, because it is all on Heims, you don't want this to roll over. So when you go to turn the truck and a load gets put onto this mount, it can push the connecting tie rod one side or the other, depending on how it's either pushing or pulling. And then that could really affect the way that the truck turns. And then things can start binding and a whole bunch of issues can come up. So to kind of mitigate that, there's pieces of Delrin inside of here that go over the misalignments inside of the swingers. And then that's holding the misalignments from basically misaligning. It's just keeping everything in line. And then what will end up happening, it's not done yet because these still need to get coated, but once the tie rods are coated, I'll go back in and tack the jam nut to the tie rod, and then also tack the jam nut to the Heim. So it won't get fully welded all the way around, but it'll get two nice, decent size, maybe like 1/2 inch welds, TIG welds on each end, just to hold everything nice and tight so nothing can break free and have this mount kind of roll back and forth.
So you're making that all rigid. So you're welding that stuff so that it can't break loose. And then you also have the Delrin in there to prevent it from rolling over. So it's kind of double secured in that regard.
Because if you just do one or the other, you can still have a problem with it. So you have to do both things. You have to put the Delrin in there, and then you also have to weld everything together so that way nothing can break free and roll on itself.
Right, because then you run into a situation where your steering's binding, and that is no good in these trucks. So you really got to be careful and kind of secure that as much as possible and ensure that there's going to be zero issues with that. Cool. So steering's on the truck. It's really nice to see the beam kit and all of that together outside and get some light on it.
Yeah, literally.
One other thing, moving back in the truck a little bit, is you have more of the tube structure that's going to end up being the Firewall in the truck. So do you want to kind of lead there and talk about how you decided to make this structure and kind of go forward with that?
It's all based around packaging. So to figure out where all these tubes ended up getting placed, one thing was shock placement, and then another thing too is that full bump and then full lock where the tire ends up at. So that's why this is all pushed back further in the truck. So when this thing cycles up, going straight, it's never an issue, but as soon as you start turning at full compression, that's really where this tire starts to get into everything in the Firewall on a factory Firewall setup. So on this truck, the plan originally was to run a 37. The way that all this is set up, he may still be able to do that, but when you get to that full bump, full lock situation, which I try and make every truck set up to where it can do that, it's just a very good practice to be able to do that. I don't think this stuff is going to clear, and the reason that is because of foot room clearance. So this truck having 3 pedals in it, it definitely makes it a lot more tight as far as pedal room goes inside of the cab. And then also too, like adding into this being a regular cab truck, you can't just start pushing that seat back further into the extra cab if it was an extra cab, and then pushing all your foot controls back further. So you're very limited on space. And if I tried to make this clear a 37 at full bump, full lock, that Firewall would have been pushed back even further. And then you're just losing even more space. Yeah.
And having the B-pillar outside of the truck definitely helps with that,
a lot, yeah.
But you're just still limited with the other packaging.
It's a single cab truck, and there's no good or bad about that. It's just what it is for this truck. That's literally what it comes down to. In terms of tube layout, what I wanted to do, like the main kind of things for this was to keep the triangulation into everything. So just kind of keeping all those triangles, keeping as many triangles in here as possible, and then also trying to think about foot room clearance, so getting as much space inside of the cab still as possible, and then also just kind of pre-running how all the tube or the plate work is going to be put back onto the truck, or the tin work.
Pre-running the tubes on the Prerunner. So we're down here. Cool. And like you have one main node here that all the tubes tie into and then kind of branch out from and go to their respective places.
Yeah, so that doing that, it just helps, same thing, like just with paneling the truck back in. So that main junction is kind of the furthest point out in the truck, kind of where your feet are going to be at, like the furthest point where your feet can go. So just kind of drawing all that out as far as possible. Still keeping in mind like clearance for shocks. So when this thing fully droops out, the coilover obviously swings back, but that still clears all of this stuff, no problem. And then also too, like this tube right here is just there tying in where the load of the shock mounts is coming through this other 2-inch tube. So just kind of tying all that stuff together. The panel work will end up coming flush against the cab here, coming out, and then running across here, and then this tube will be exposed. So this will be sitting out in space, so you can still reach your hand in here and be able to get to the shock mount bolts and all that stuff too. Cool. But kind of that's on this outside portion of it, and then it also, there's a tube back here which is kind of hidden when you're looking at it from like a side profile. There's a tube back here as well that also goes into where kind of the trans tunnel is going to start at. So there's the tube that runs down here down to the frame just to tie in more structure from the A-pillar. Everything kind of runs down through the truck. And then there's also the tube coming from that junction that comes up to that where the trans tunnel will be. And then there's another one that comes down to the frame as well. So that kind of ties in from the top of your like windshield intrusion bars. It comes down, it transfers out, and then it also goes down in the truck and then comes down to the frame. So there's a lot going on right there. And you can kind of see it better once we get into the inside. You can kind of see where all those tubes like land on the frame, and then also running across to start for that trans tunnel.
Cool. So moving inside, first thing that you notice is that the seats are in the truck. So this is something that's kind of actively going. You're trying to figure out where to position these.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about where you're at with that process?
Yeah, so the seats are in their positions as far as front to back in the truck, angle in the truck, height in the truck, and then also width in the truck. Like all that stuff is set. They're tacked in place just in the backside, and if you pick up the plastic, you can kind of see what the mounts look like that are going on right there.
Liking what I'm seeing here.
3 holes, baby.
Cool. And then this back tube, you can see here you did have to cut the pivot boxes a little bit in order to get the seats where you wanted to. And like it looks a little rough right now.
I'm sure I'll get a bunch of shit for that, because there's people saying, oh, those pivot boxes look like they're gonna be in the way. It is what it is.
It is what it is.
I could have ran the way that it was. You would have sat higher in the truck, which was just not ideal. So dropping everything down, it just feels more natural in the truck. The seats, if they went any lower, you kind of start fighting because of the space constraint front to back in the cab. When you start dropping the seat down lower, your knees, if you could picture it, your knees start going at more of an angle to the floor. So the lower you go, the more bent your knees are. The higher up you go, the more straight your knees go. So this is kind of like a nice happy medium where this is at. And then you still have plenty of head clearance. You probably saw in the clip, because you're going to add it, of Ryan sitting in here.
Definitely.
There's plenty of head clearance in here to where his head's at. Even with, once he puts a helmet on or a headset on, you have plenty of clearance to these 2 main tubes. So where the seats are at are
very like first stages of getting these things in,
100%,
and kind of figuring out where they're going to sit. Which,
it's very rough.
Now you've sat in it, I've sat in it, Ryan has sat in it, our dad has sat in it as well. And like Ryan is the main one that we're trying to position the driver's seat for. But for all of us, it's very comfortable with.
Well, and something to note too is we're all over 6 foot. So that's another thing too, is like if we were smaller, I had my mom sit in this thing yesterday, and she had 1,000,000 miles of clearance in this, but she's real small. So having 6 foot and taller people be able to fit into this regular cab truck is definitely a big, like, it's not as easy as if you were a smaller person trying to fit in here. So it's just getting the packaging right with this, because the main thing is you want the driver and passenger to, one, feel safe, but also be comfortable in the truck.
Definitely.
So we need to make sure that happens.
And now, like, with where this is at, the biggest challenge going forward is going to be the pedal positioning, which I know you've already been thinking a lot about. And again, just the challenge with that is that we're going to be running 3 pedals in this truck, because it is a manual. So all that has to be taken into account with the kind of limited space that's over there currently. Is going to be a packaging challenge on your end to find a solution.
And it'll probably end up getting custom pedals. Like, I'll have to build the gas pedal, I'll have to build the brake pedal, and I'll have to build the clutch pedal. It's not going to be something that you can just run off the shelf. So which is cool, because then that's just another thing that I get to like put my mind to and try and figure out, and it's something to solve. So it's one of those things where like is it the most ideal situation where you can just buy off the shelf parts and run it? No, but it's giving me a problem to solve, and I enjoy doing that. So
yep. Cool. So let's talk a little bit, since it's a little bit easier to see now, some of the tube structure that's going on up here. So you mentioned coming down from the window tubes, it coming down back to the frame rail.
Yes.
So you can see that much more clearly here, and then also tied together with this intermediate tube as well.
Yeah, so I'm kind of like inside of the cab, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit. So that was part of the main portion of getting the engine cage in, is getting that firewall section figured out too. And then once I got to this stage, I wanted to start going on like the trans tunnel, but I couldn't do that until I had seats kind of in their spot where they were going to go, so I can figure out where they were going to run through the center of the truck, the main tubes for the trans tunnel. So that's kind of why I jumped over to starting on seat mounts. But now that these are here and I can see where the shifter's at and where everything's kind of going to be placed at, I can start. The next thing now is going to be starting on getting those main tubes for the trans tunnel in, and I can start lacing that out and getting all that dialed in, and then I can start figuring out flooring and all that stuff. And I know a lot of people were asking about seeing this truck before all the tin work got put in it, so they could see the tube structure of everything in here.
Yep.
So that'll be something that we'll cover, because I don't think I'll be paneling this thing in before the next video. So they'll be able to see that whole center the trans tunnel deal will be in there. Seat mounts will be mounted, and then I'll start probably. Well, I don't know how much you're gonna put of like the clips of Ryan and I talking, but like the next thing will be getting pedal assembly in here, getting somewhat of a floor in here, and then that's when the steering wheel will start to get mounted as well.
Yep. Cool. So I mean, that's kind of the main updates in here, correct? Is just this tubing structure here, and then starting to get the seats in.
Yeah, and that's like what we were touching on too, is like you can see like where everything comes down and lands on the frame too. So it all ties in, everything ties in at similar points on everything. It's all triangulated. The only like kind of weird pocket window is this right here, which is pretty common that I've seen on a lot of trucks that have like a fully built out firewall like this. You end up with like a square section right here in the middle, which there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It almost acts like, if I wanted to, I could put a little access panel in here so you can get to stuff on the back side of the engine a little bit easier. And then there will probably be some access panels on the trans tunnel as well to be able to get to like bell housing bolts a little bit easier, or whatever you need to on the back side of the engine, or the top of the trans if you needed to. But it's just like the layout of everything as far as the firewall goes, like it's literally all dictated around packaging on the truck. That's the main thing, and keeping as much space in the cab as possible. And then you could, like, to make that happen too, you could see like header clearance. This has the factory manifolds on it, but you can see like where the dumps are for the manifolds. And this thing, we were going back and forth on doing like a custom, like an aftermarket header, or me building a set of headers for this. And it's just not, I can do that, but it's just not really cost effective to do that, knowing it's getting a different power plant later. So keeping everything tight right now, it's fine the way that it is. It'll run perfectly fine. The motor had a bunch of power before, so I don't plan on putting like a big massive exhaust on this thing to make it sound crazy. Like, it'll get what it needs to keep the same amount of back pressure as it has factory, so it's making as much power and torque that it had previously, instead of just sounding cool going down the road. So
cool. And like one thing that you touched on here, and it's something that we mentioned a lot, is just packaging. Like, a lot of building these trucks is just being able to package everything.
Yeah.
We're trying to run a big tire. We're trying to have a lot of wheel travel. We're pushing the engine back. Like, there's a lot of things moving, and it's really taking up a lot of space. So you just have to design around that, and packaging dictates a lot of the design choices on these trucks. Cool. Is there anything else in here that you might want to touch on? No,
I think honestly we're pretty caught up to where everything is at right now.
Yeah, no, rear, you haven't been touching too much, but
no.
I just want to get some like cool overall shots of this thing.
Yeah.
As we're going through it, and it's just nice to see this thing outside and be able to admire all the work being done on it.
And it's like the truck right now too is pretty close to ride height. So this truck is definitely a lot smaller than
I mean, it's really hard to tell in the garage, but once you finally get things outside, you can take a look at it and see, like, get a new perspective on it and see actually how big it is. And this thing,
how
like,
big,
the first thing that you said when we pulled it,
yeah,
the first thing that you said when we pulled it out is this thing's like a short course truck.
It's a stadium truck is what it looks like.
One other cool thing is just seeing like the rear of the truck
like a rear profile.
Yeah, I mean, it might be a little bit difficult with the sun right now, but, and that is a 37 spare, but this thing looks wild from the back.
It's your custom jack stand.
Yeah, full custom. Yeah, this thing, it definitely needs to get resprung.
Yeah.
Which, like, you already knew that was going to be the case. But
Well, it's just shocks that were bought just on a whim. It was the right diameter and length, but it just had some random ass spring rate put on them. So it's a 200 over 200 pound spring rate on the rear. There's no fuel in the tank. There's nothing, and it sits. If I pull that piece of wood out right now, it sits like
I mean, we put how much preload in it?
way lower. Right after I added it a second time, it's probably got 3 or 4 inches of preload in it,
And it's still way low.
there's not
with
even
no
any weight really.
Yeah. So yeah, that'll definitely have to get swapped out, but that's like very simple and is
Well, that's the
something else to
thing.
be
I'm not.
expected.
I don't care about spring rate right now. I'd rather wait until the truck is fully together, and then I can get with down south, and we can come up with what the spring rate needs to be once it's done, and we can just do a one and done kind of thing instead of sit here and try and contemplate what the spring rate is going to be.
Definitely.
Based off like just what we think it's going to be instead of actually knowing what it is. And this
Yeah, like the truck needs to be finished out. And then
truck
you
needs
can
to be
get a
finished
better
out.
idea.
And another thing too is I want to have this truck weighed. So I want to do corner weights and figure out what the truck weighs front to back, side to side, all that kind of stuff. And then we can base a spring rate off of all that stuff.
Cool. Well, I mean, I think that's going to be a good place to wrap this one. I know we try to answer a lot of your guys' questions that you had in the comments, either directly in the comment section of the last video or throughout this video. Like I know we touched on mounting the shocks in the front, which was a question I saw in the last one. And yeah, just taking your recommendations with the mics as well. So let us know down below if you guys like this video. But as always, please like, comment, and subscribe. See you in the next one.
Peace.